Royal Highness, distinguished guests, welcome to this panel called Thinking the Unthinkable, the Risk of Nuclear Confrontation. I'm Karin von Hippel, the director of a think tank in London called the Royal United Services Institute, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you here today with this incredible panel to talk about the risk of nuclear confrontation. I think for a bit of background, I think if we consider the global situation today with respect to nuclear threats, there are at least six big reasons for concern to be despondent, starting, of course, with Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine and, of course, the thinly veiled nuclear threats. The second is, of course, the issue of reviving the Iran nuclear deal. What are the possibilities of that? We've heard President Biden admit that, off mic anyway, that the Iran deal is dead. But of course, the negotiations anyway have been eclipsed by the brutal repression at home and by the Iranian regime supplying weapons to armed drones that are being used right now in Ukraine. So that's a second challenge. If we move to North Korea, earlier this month, Kim Jong-un ordered the exponential expansion of his country's nuclear arsenal. He also wanted to mass-produce tactical nuclear weapons and the development of a more powerful intercontinental ballistic missile. This is raising the tensions on the Korean Peninsula to their highest since 2017. Welcome, Your Royal Highness. Welcome. Then we have China, of course, which is expanding and diversifying its nuclear arsenal. It's aiming to be the third nuclear power. And yet, China does not participate in any of the strategic arms control talks. We look at the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has helped to limit countries with nuclear weapons to 9. And it's been quite successful, but today's insecure environment is prompting some non-nuclear states to consider going nuclear. We heard South Korea recently made such a statement. Lots of concerns about that. And then, of course, we're facing new threats from advanced weapon systems, advanced capabilities. And many of them, like hypersonic missiles, are not also included in any of our current international negotiation structures. So overall, there's a lot to be worried about. And it really does lead some experts to conclude that we may be at the greatest risk of a nuclear confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. One scholar, author, Eric Schlosser, made a very stark comment in an issue of The Atlantic last June, and he said if a nuclear weapon is used in Ukraine, the decisions that would have to be made after a Russian nuclear strike on Ukraine are unprecedented. So we are in a really scary situation. But luckily, today we have a distinguished expert panel who is going to help us talk through these very complex issues. We have with us, of course, Foreign Minister of Lithuania, Gabrielius Landsbergis. We have the Chief Executive of the European Defense Agency, Jiří Šedivý. I can never pronounce his name. We have the Honorable Jane Harman, who is the Chair of Board of Trustees at Freedom House, and then Professor Vali Nasr from the School of International Studies at SAIS. And they are going to help us think through whether our current international agreements and arrangements are agile enough to meet today's challenges, and if not, what more can be done? What else can we do? We are asking our panel to think the unthinkable. We are going to try not to admire the problem. It's very easy to admire the problem when you talk about the nuclear threat, but we really want to try to make bold recommendations. Just in terms of format, I'm going to ask each of them several questions, and then there will still be time for all of you to pose some questions towards the end. But before we kick off, we're going to have a Slido poll, which is coming up on the screen. And if you could all pull out your cell phones and just put your camera app on and answer the poll.
Oh, we're supposed to do it.
Will Russia use a nuclear weapon in its war on Ukraine in the next 5 years? We're going to do the poll again at the end to see if any of you have changed your mind after listening to this panel. So let's give everybody a second.
Where is it?
The no's are having it. That's interesting. Okay, I think almost everyone is done. Are we done, Melissa? Okay, great. So the answer is no. 65% say no, 35% say yes. Oh, going down to 32 and up to 68. So let me start out with the foreign minister of Lithuania. And let's start out with the big issue, which is, of course, Russia. Thinly veiled threats. I know they haven't overtly said they would use nuclear weapons, but of course, Russia, Putin being Putin, comes up with all sorts of creative ways to threaten the use of weapons without using those words. How can he be deterred from using a nuclear weapon in this war? And some people think he may even be bluffing. If he has been bluffing, has his rhetoric worked, I guess? Can you start us out with that, please?
Thank you so much for the question. And I would start with the poll question, because it not only poses the question, but offers an assumption that the war will take 5 years. Not sure about that. So just when you're answering, keep that in mind, that you're also saying that you agree with the 5 years, which I would not necessarily subscribe to. The second thing is, I think we need to start from where probably, because there's a lot of guesswork in this, where Putin is coming from. And I would start a bit before the war with a whole set of narratives that Russia was trying to create successfully in many cases and persuade us that they are right ones. For example, that Russia's army is the second in the world when it comes to the power of the army. And honestly, just before the war, or even at the first days of war last year in February, at the end of February, many of my colleagues in European Union or NATO would have told me and others that, look, the resistance by Ukrainians is basically futile. Kiev will fall. And we've heard that from very knowledgeable partners with a lot of intelligence, with a lot of information, that it's impossible to withstand such an enormous and well-prepared army. And we found out that it was a bluff. Mm-hmm. So basically, if we roll back a little bit more, we can clearly say that Russia was actively trying to persuade itself, most likely its leadership, and us about their capacity of doing things. Mm-hmm. We've witnessed that very closely because every 4 years we would have military training just outside the Lithuanian border. It was called Zapad, with lots and lots of troops, with all kinds of equipment, and in some cases, yes, with nuclear, showing that the nuclear use of nuclear weapon would be possible as a part of training, but then in the military operation as well. So creating a narrative of power is one of the tools that Russia is using. Why does it need it now? To create an atmosphere of fear and to navigate our decision-making process. That's the way I'm reading that, and I think that it's the most clear path. In order to deter us from sending weapons to Ukraine, in order to deter the decision-making process, to slow the decision-making process, because even this debate shows that the discussion has started. And it influences all other series of decisions that need to be made in order to assist Ukraine faster. So to create fear in order to slow us down. Mm-hmm. So the first answer, if we agree on this notion, is not to give in to fear and blackmail. Mm-hmm. Because it not only would be used in this conflict, but it also shows to other actors that this is a way to go. So basically everybody, malign actor, having their hands on nuclear arms would do the same, because if Russia can do that successfully, then it definitely works. That does not mean that we need to take it lightly. Mm-hmm. Being not afraid does not mean that you should not be prepared. And this is where we need to be prepared. And the West has already won one nuclear confrontation, being Cold War, without firing a single nuclear weapon at each other. Patience, deterrence, arming yourself, and and out-arming yourself. That actually worked in 80s, it worked in 90s, and led to the fall of Soviet Union. Unfortunately, we might be at the time where we need to blow the dust off old textbooks from the Cold War and see what worked back then and recreate certain scenarios right now. Meaning that we, first of all, I would just repeat what probably many panelists across the number of panels here in Davos told today, that we need to help Ukraine win. That is number one thing. Second thing, we need to arm the countries that are at risk, Lithuania being at one, eastern flank, take all the way from Estonia to Bulgaria. Countries need to have credible deterrence. Build coalitions, international coalitions. That already happened, even with China and diplomatic approach to China in order to get them to say a few words about this, and they successfully did. And be patient.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Jiří, I know you're speaking here in your personal capacity, but of course you have been worried about these types of issues for a long time. And I want to ask you about the whole question of the advances in technology and how that's in many ways exacerbating the nuclear threat, whether it's outer space, cyberspace, AI, et cetera, advanced conventional weapons and others like hypersonics, as I mentioned. How does deterrence work, going back on what the foreign minister mentioned, deterrence, how does deterrence work in the face of this more complicated technological landscape?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the disclaimer. I'm speaking in my personal capacity now. Deterrence works. I mean, if we speak about deterrence of the West, which is based indeed above all on the Pillar 1, NATO, but also European Union adds in a way. So it works. Now, with all these new technologies and new means that you mentioned, actually, they are part of the deterrence. If you look at the NATO documents and then, let's say, the nuclear consultations amongst the allies, there is the definition that deterrence rests on an appropriate mix of nuclear capabilities, conventional capabilities, complemented by space and cyber capabilities. Yeah. Now, cyberspace, relatively new military domains, but very fast growing. And I would even say that actually having this wider spectrum of instruments and concepts under what the Americans are now actually rethinking in terms of integrated deterrence. So it's not just nuclear, just conventional. I think that actually it adds the credibility of deterrence in terms of, indeed, deterrence is above all keeping the opponent unsure about exact the response, but sure about response. Yeah?
Right.
About the form. Now, if you have much more instruments, you can combine. You are more resilient. Yeah? So I believe that in that respect, those new technologies are actually adding to the resilience, to the spectrum of deterrence. You mentioned hypersonic weapons, and this is different story, and I'm afraid that we can see pretty soon this sector of weaponry becoming a game changer. We see quite fast development of those weapons, and not always in countries that are our friends. And above all, these weapons, indeed, that are combining the speed of, let's say, ballistic missiles with maneuverability. They are going to compress the time for spotting, for decision making. Yeah. They are also very much, I would say, ambiguous about the target area. Yeah, it's not like ballistic missile where you can calculate. It's also the question, the ambiguity about the payload. And above all, very difficult for defense. Yeah, for defense. So here, actually, we can see really sort of a challenge to strategic stability. And here also, actually, I would strongly recommend to start talks and think at least thinking first amongst the, let's say, scientists, academics, about how to regulate this, about how to control this, how to create a regime, actually, that would address this challenge, because truly strategic balance is or might be very soon at stake.
Great. Okay, thank you for that. Jane, I'm going to take you to China now, the question I mentioned earlier. It's hard to see a future for long-term deterrence, of course, for nuclear arms reduction if China does not get involved in the talks. China, of course, has made the case that, well, we're too small, we're catching up, et cetera. Of course, we also have the additional challenge of Russia now being a pariah. And so what do we do? Can we bring China in? How do we bring China in?
Well, thank you, and hello, everyone. We have to bring China in. We're not going to have any effective or peaceful enough world to live in if we don't somehow include China in a number of discussions, including terrorism, climate, and obviously limiting nuclear weapons. I just say a few things first, though. I'm an optimist. If I weren't, I wouldn't have served in the United States Congress for 9 terms. And bashing China in the United States Congress is a team sport in both political parties, in case you're reading the newspapers. That is unfortunate, in my view, because I do think while China is wrong in a number of areas, we also have to compete with China and cooperate with China. That's the point I'm making. And I see a couple of things that make me optimistic about China and nuclear weapons. One is that several of our key officials, including the president met with Xi, I guess a couple months ago, on the sidelines of one of the economic conferences, and they talked about boundaries. Janet Yellen, I read, is this week meeting with her counterpart to talk about forms of cooperation. And I think that China has many reasons to want, at this point, to ratchet down some of their rhetoric, including the fact today in the newspaper that they are now at negative population. India is going to surpass China in terms of population by the end of the decade. Their economy is in trouble. They have a COVID epidemic because of the way they mishandled COVID. And I think that even if she even wants to think about, and I hope he doesn't think about it in the wrong way, an excursion into Taiwan, he'd better focus on that and not focus on a nuclear confrontation. Last comment. I think that if we can somehow reach for China, that is the way to curb Russia, because Russia is quickly, given Putin's miscalculation in Ukraine, becoming a vassal state of China, and will have to listen to a lecture from China. And I would just close with this. When she was meeting with Olaf Scholz a month or two ago, they issued a communique that urged no states to use nuclear weapons. So I think that that was a shot across the bow of Russia by China. And I think there are lots of other reasons why we should be worried about nuclear weapons, but I think there is a road to create an understanding in the future with China.
Yeah, no, there's a very good point, and there's certainly a perception that part of the reason the rhetoric has been tamped down a bit is precisely because she may have been putting pressure on Putin behind the scenes. Vali, let's go to Iran and the potential chances of reviving the Iran deal. Some of us in this room were in a previous panel on the whole challenge facing Iranian women today, and there was certainly a concern that the Americans and the Europeans will push forward on the deal and not worry about the repression at home. But how can, is the deal dead? Can we do nuclear diplomacy negotiations and also put pressure on the regime to stop supplying weapons to the Russians, to stop repressing and killing its own children and women at home? How do you square that circle?
It's a very good question. It's a very big challenge for policymakers to how do you handle a country where there are multiple set of very significant problems with it all at once. Now, I have to say that even before the protests started, the nuclear deal was already in very big trouble for the reason that for the United States in particular, A lot of the provisions of the deal were coming due this year in 2023. So pretty much the deal, they would be going into a deal that was almost expired. For the Iranians, the view was that the United States would always sign a deal, but it will not implement a deal. And neither side eventually was able to get to it. And then the protests happened. Now, the protests have obviously complicated things on for reasons that you mentioned. One is that it obviously has changed attention completely internationally. It's isolated Iran. It created now a vision of a pariah state. There's no mood anywhere in the West for any kind of a deal, because the deal suggests that you need to lift sanctions on Iran, whereas everybody's arguing for more sanctions, not just because of the protests, but also because of Ukraine. In fact, even pacifist civil society groups in Europe now are arguing against a nuclear deal with Iran. So in that kind of an environment, whether it's President Biden or the European governments would not want to be seen to be lifting sanctions. U.S. Congress is not going to support that. So the protests have basically changed the domestic environment in the West around sanctions. And in the case of Iran, rightly or wrongly in their own mind, that this is their enemies are egging on these protests or taking advantage of it, they will not come to the table from a position of weakness. They already were not willing to sign before. Right now, they see it as basically surrender. So in a way, yes, the deal is dead. And the problem of thinking about this is the protests are extremely important in Iran, for the future of Iran, for the future of that whole region. But the protests are not a solution to the nuclear issue. And it's always important to keep in mind that the clocks are different. The clock of the protests may be 6 months, a year, 2 years. The clock of the nuclear issue is within a matter of weeks or months. In other words, as we are talking, as the protests are going on, they may become a threshold state. They may cross it. So yes, the West needs to chew gum and walk at the same time. And it's not doing that. And that, in my opinion, is a great danger. Now, if there is no nuclear deal, if it's dead, then what? So there's two scenarios. One is that there could be a ceasefire deal, a kind of a less for less deal. It's not a full JCPOA. I'm just throwing ideas out there. One side says, okay, we won't go beyond 20% to 60%. We will stay here in exchange for which they may get some relief on sale of oil, et cetera. Again, the West has to deal with the domestic consequences of that. It's not a solution, but it means that you're not going to have an imminent crisis in the next few months when you're also dealing with Ukraine at the same time. And I also have to say, Iranian involvement in Ukraine has to do with this. One is that the more they've got isolated from Europe because of the protests, the more they need Russia. They need a strategic depth. Secondly, they want to get a bargaining over Ukraine with the West, particularly with Europe. If you don't want us to give them missiles or the next level up weaponry, what do we get? And thirdly, they wanted to showcase what they have. So in case we're thinking about a war with Iran, they wanted to show their material. Now, if there is no ceasefire either, I just see that there's going to be conflict. And there's a number of ways this can happen in the next few months. One is that at some point, once they're ready, they may make a decision or an announcement that they're actually going to go to 60% or 90%. I don't see Israel or Saudi Arabia being extremely comfortable with that. They are more worried about the Iran scenario than the West is. So then either Israelis will act or the United States would have to act. And once you act, unless you do it completely, totally, it only will encourage Iran to go nuclear faster. In other words, a conflict is an accelerator. And the second issue is really a deadline coming up in October, which is very key, which is in October, the United Nations sanctions on Iran's sale of weapons will come off. And more than likely, United States and the P5, not P5, the P3 really, I would say, will probably try to snap back sanctions on Iran. Iran has already said that if there's snapback sanctions, they will leave the non-proliferation treaty and they will come out of international atomic energy. That also is a trigger. I don't think Israel or Saudi Arabia or the United States would welcome that. And so this is right now going very rapidly towards a much bigger crisis point.
Okay, we're still admiring the problem. I'm going to come back to you in a minute on what more we can do in the region. I'm going to come back to the foreign minister. And actually, you mentioned earlier, we all thought Russia had the second best army or military in the world. Today, an American congressman mentioned we thought they had the second best army. We found out they had the second best military in Ukraine, which was, I thought, a very good line. It's not mine, but let me go back on, this concern that if they do launch some sort of nuclear attack, likely tactical nukes, likely in a way that hopefully doesn't cause civilian damage, but we don't know. I mean, in other words, they could demonstrate something over the Black Sea, or they could destroy a city. We don't know what they will do. There's an argument, of course, by many experts that if we get wind that they're moving weapons around because we can monitor all that, we should release the intelligence just like before the war started. But what would be the appropriate response from NATO if Russia lets off a nuclear weapon? And I guess a related question is, I often find that public officials are afraid to talk about what we need to do to the public because they're worried, we don't want to go there, it's too scary. But then it's not fair to the public because I think people need to know what to expect, what to think about, not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere. I mean, my neighbors in London are buying hazmat suits. And, I just think people need more of a awareness about how to think about, there's got to be a responsible approach and public needs to be made aware of the rest. So question of what should we do? And then, how do we talk about it?
Well, first of all, again, I would start from the point I made about narratives. We need our narratives. We're still not extremely good at it. We are fighting all kinds of malign narratives, especially in the Baltics, for example. We've seen that for many years, and we are still in the process of learning how to counter them. How do you calm people down, but so that they're calm but prepared, and all these sort of things. So I think that we have to learn from certain things that were implemented in the Baltics or in Lithuania, and then spread those things into other countries who are worried. When it comes to practically what do we need to do, I think it's clear what was said about ambiguity, about a certainty of an answer, but ambiguity of what kind of answer there might be. Therefore, we witnessed for several occasions during the last year when the officials and politicians, high-ranking officers, would actually say what they're not going to do. Like, we will never...
Yeah, right.
Et cetera, et cetera. And I would not agree that this is the best way forward. I would suggest that we have to be very clear that there will be an answer, but we're still figuring it out.
Good, okay.
And I think that this then it hinders the calculations on the other side.
Yeah.
Because now, for example, just an example, it was clearly stated that you will never, ever see NATO troops in Ukraine. Maybe it's right. I'm representing a NATO country. Probably it's a consensus. That could be, we could have kept that in mind. Not necessarily tell that. Because now Russia knows that there are very clear and specific red lines that we've imposed on ourselves. It destroys the ambiguity. It actually creates a very clear picture as to where we are. And therefore, I would leave that out and say we will have an answer if it escalates. Because, just a last note, we had an answer when Russia escalated. Unfortunately, we always had an answer when they escalated on the civilian areas. Now, I'm pretty sure that we will start sending main battle tanks to Ukraine. Because of what we've seen in Dnipro, because of the, 7 or 17 children who were killed by a rocket. And so that means that we are reacting, we are doing more, but and we have not told that what we do. So we already practice this strategy.
Okay, thank you for that. Jiří, let's go back to European defense investments, perhaps, because this is your portfolio after all. Still in your personal capacity, what should be, or not, whatever you choose, but what should be the priorities for Europe's investments in advanced strategic capabilities, especially as it pertains to potential nuclear conflict?
First of all, I should emphasize that indeed deterrence and defense is located in NATO. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And this is recognized in all EU strategy documents. At the same time, the war in Ukraine, the aggression was a wake-up call for all of us. Not only concerning actually Russia itself, but also concerning our very limited capacities, as we are realizing through actually the very high velocity of consumption of military material, especially ammunition, in this war. And we all are trying to support Ukraine by all means, but our stockpiles are being emptied. So now we realize that actually we have really lived in perhaps too relaxed way concerning our military capacity. And at the same time, we see very, I would say, strong effort on the part, and I'm speaking about the European Union's member, to bridge what we identified as defense investment gaps. We see quite fast increase in the aggregated defense budgets. Last year, it was something like 220 billion euro for the EU members together, and we expect that within 2-3 years, actually, there will be another 80 billion plus, so we can be around 2025, 26, close to 300 billion euro. We have various instruments how to actually improve joint procurement. We have European Defence Fund, and above all, and I'm going to the core of your question, we know actually where to invest. We have a strategic compass, which is excellent document, very ambitious, approved by the heads of states and government last year. And here actually you have a clearly defined, a very, I would say, ambitious portfolio or set of strategic capabilities that EU should develop, or member states should develop over the coming 10-15 years. And those are capabilities that should enable European Union also to act more autonomously. This is extremely important. It supports NATO, single set of forces, as we say, but at the same time, we must be ready for scenarios, and those scenarios will be, I'm afraid, quite soon coming upon us, EU, that there will be a combination impacts of climate change, failed states, sub-Saharan Africa, large migrations, organized crime, terrorism on one hand, requiring a reaction on the other hand. This will not be Article 5 defense, collective defense situation, and the United States might be actually engaged elsewhere in Asia Pacific. And already we are hearing from our US colleagues, please invest into strategic enablers. Invest in the in European capacities to act, to sustain your forces. Invest in your missile air and missile defenses. Invest in your even capacity to plan and conduct, means command, control, intelligence, surveillance, etc., etc. So these, I would say, are those capabilities that are coming as a depth from the past, and then while trying to remedy the investment gaps from the past, we must look into the future. And here, new technologies, disruptive technologies are coming. I must not say unmanned systems, means pilotless systems of all kinds. I was prohibited by Karin. Artificial intelligence, new materials, etc., etc. Okay. So we now are at the crucial cross point, where actually we should really, I would say, put the money and effort where the mouth is.
Great, thank you. Jane, let me push you a bit further on. You mentioned Russia when you talked about China. Of course, during the Cold War, tensions were very high, and we managed to negotiate deals with with the Soviet Union about arms control. We negotiated significant treaties as well. at the moment, we only have the New START treaty, and it's the last remaining nuclear arms treaty between the United States and Russia, although it doesn't account for tactical nukes, as you pointed out earlier. The Russians have postponed talks, and the U.S. is saying publicly, at least, maybe similar to the Iran deal, they want the talks to restart. But how do we do this, given the overall situation in the area?
Well, I think it's virtually impossible right now to do it. I think trust has been destroyed. Mm-hmm. I think Russia is run by one person who has isolated himself and isolated his country from the world, and I don't see it happening that way. You know, you talk about thinking the unthinkable. Well, what about this? In 5 years, we will have developed a whole new set of mechanisms to control and limit the spread of nuclear weapons in the world. It will be different from what we have now because we need to have many more countries in it, especially China. I think this is a time to think differently. But on specifically Russia in the next year or two, or at least until this Ukraine war is over, I don't see it. And we have pushed Russia out of many organizations, I think properly, but that further isolates any channel we had. As Vali was saying, it's not the P5 anymore on Iran, it's the P3. That means China and Russia, who used to be in the room talking about many other things while the JCPOA was negotiated, aren't there anymore. So I guess I'm a pessimist. I just want to make one comment on technology, and that is, it has many positive aspects. It also has a big negative aspect. Dis and misinformation are all over the world, and one of the big dangers about nuclear confrontation is misinformation, miscalculation, misperception about what the other side is about to do. And I can see technology being used in really horrible ways to shatter expectations that hopefully were made by rational people to do rational things.
Okay, great. Vali, let me ask you about the region, and then I'm going to open it up for some questions. You did touch on this in your first answer, but the Middle East countries, not including Iran, have been incredibly stressed out, some say paranoid, about Iran. We've seen that with many. There has been talk of Saudi investing in its own nuclear capability. We have a new Israeli government that I think most countries in the Middle East are loath to work with, at the moment anyway. If you talked about, well, if the deal doesn't come through, these are the less for less, but what is the plan B for the region?
Right. I mean, even if Iran was to go nuclear, it's going to take a number of years before it is in a position to sort of have a nuclear confrontation with Israel at the level of which we see between India and Pakistan. So for now, really the nuclear issue is just a destabilizing issue in the region. So you have a new Israeli government with Prime Minister Netanyahu, which whatever else he has on his plate, domestically or regionally, he has been singularly focused on Iran for a very long time. And so these trigger points that I mentioned, that if Iran was to go to 60%, if Iran was to come out of NPT, would probably be something that he could essentially react to, and then you then end up in a cycle of confrontation. I would expect that the acts of sabotage, other strategies that Israel used when he was prime minister would return, and at any point you could have an engagement. I think Saudi Arabia, UAE are following a much more sophisticated strategy of managing their risk, which is not relying on the United States or Israel per se. At one level, they're trying to reduce tensions with Iran. UAE sent back its ambassador to Iran. Saudi Arabia, at least for a period, had some security conversations. They are also engaging Russia and China in ways that we cannot do in the West. For instance, when President Xi just visited Saudi Arabia, he came out and very specifically told Iran to cool it off in the region. So this was at the behest of the Saudis and UAE, and it was a very powerful message to Iran. We don't talk to Putin, but the rulers of the Gulf do. And there also they try to leverage whatever relationship they have over oil with Putin to have those back conversations in a way of trying to keep things down. Now, all of this suggests to you that obviously they're really, really worried. You know, it's not like they think the problem's gone away. They also are cheering for the protesters, but they're realistic in knowing that this is not a problem that's going to get solved in the next 3-4 months, and that they have to prepare for it. So the key question is, you know, does the West help here? Does it actually help its allies in the region manage this, or are we just going to give it to them to do it? But I think, you know, they're having their own theory of how to manage this crisis in ways that they think will serve their interests.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to take some rapid, very precise, brief questions from whoever wants to ask. We have a few minutes, and then if I could ask the panel just to respond in very short. We only have actually 5 minutes. So do we have a microphone that's coming right? There you go.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Can you introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, Beatrice Voss, I'm VP Legal at Elanco Animal Health. Article 5 of the NATO treaty was mentioned. If Russia used a nuclear weapon in Ukraine and radiation would move to Europe, to Poland or other neighboring countries through the air, through water, could that trigger Article 5?
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, over there, please.
I have a question for Professor Nasr.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Jonathan Greenblatt. I'm the head of the ADL. I don't agree with the characterization that Bibi's been singly focused on Iran. I think Iran has been singly focused on Israel for a very long time through its proxies and whatnot, you know, long before Bibi came back into power. My question is, what do you think is the prospect of Iran arming one of its proxies, like the Houthis or Hezbollah or others, with sort of a dirty bomb or something that would give them plausible deniability, since proxies seem to be the main way they prosecute their conflict against Israel?
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. And any other questions? Okay. Well, let's just go through it quickly. I guess I'll start with you, Vali, because last one for you.
So let me, I didn't mean that he doesn't think about anything else. I meant that among Israeli leaders, he's been the one who's been particularly focused on Iran being the single biggest danger to Israel, sometimes in dispute with sometimes his own security leaders. So he brings to Israel's policy a degree of sharpness that he had before and maybe the other governments didn't have. So that's what I meant. I don't think technologically Iran is there yet to give dirty bomb, but I do think they are arming all of their proxies with much more advanced guiding systems, the kinds of weaponry that they're showcasing in Ukraine, which means that Hezbollah, Houthis, proxies in Syria and Iraq are going to be much more lethal. And that's what I meant, that one of the reasons they're giving these weapons to Ukraine is exactly to showcase that what is the next generation, next level, next generation sort of offensive weaponry they can bring to the region. So I think that's already happening. That's part of the way in which they're sort of building both offense and defense, and that's why it's becoming very, very dangerous.
Great. And then the radioactive spread, Jane or Jiří or Foreign Minister, do you want to just do quickly?
I've actually been thinking about this. If I could just add one other thing to Vali, though, don't forget proliferation of nuclear material out of North Korea. There certainly has been the rumor forever that Pakistan has already sold a bomb to Saudi Arabia, whether that's true or not. But so it could happen even without final development by Israel, that Israel all of a sudden has weapons which it could put in the hands of some of its proxies. But on the Zaporizhzhia thing, I don't think there is an answer, but I wrote an op-ed recently saying all of the reckless things that Russia is doing, bombing around the reactor, could easily cause, or could cause, the core to melt, the water table to be polluted, radiation to escape, and it wouldn't just escape toward Russia, which is what a lot of people hope would happen since Russia would have done it, but it would escape toward Europe. And if there is radiation in the air and other pollution in NATO countries, you would think it would trigger Article 5, but I don't think there's a conclusive answer to that.
Jiří, did you want to jump in? Or?
Totally agree.
Okay.
It would depend on the context, on the level of damage, etc., etc. And Article 5 actually is a conditional political sort of a statement. Yeah. So really would depend on many factors, and indeed, I mean, it's consensual. Yeah. So.
Not just separation, but also Chernobyl too, right, Minister?
So I will just add that Article 5 is still a political decision. That means that it's actually we have to agree on the context, and but this is exactly the question about in the answer about the ambiguity. So I would say maybe yes, maybe no.
Okay, do we have time to do the poll one more time before everyone leaves? Okay, one more time. Can you pull out your cell phones to see if you change your mind?
What was the result?
The first time it was no.
68, 32?
68 no, yeah. Let's see. I mean, a few people have left, but it doesn't necessarily change the percentages. You can vote too if you want. Okay, still no. Pretty similar. Okay. Well, listen, I just want to thank our speakers for a really excellent panel. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in a warm round of applause.
Thank you.